Hello everyone, and welcome along to this edition of IoTSF's monthly webinar series for 2023. Just whilst everybody arrives, I've got the following to mention. The past two webinars from IoTSF have been to do with SBOM, that was in February, and Smart Built Environment Guidance in March. Both of those webinars tied in with new publications that were a direct result of IoTSF's working groups. If you're not an IoTSF member, then you'll probably be unfamiliar with a great website called Basecamp, which is a project management site where IoTSF has all of its working group activity. So the current working groups are the Assurance Framework Working Group, the Best Practice Guides Working Group, Smart Built Environment Working Group as well. There's also the Many Secured Special Interest Group and the Supply Chain Integrity Project. So if you're an IoTSF member and you'd like to be involved in any of those groups, or if you'd like to just look in and see what's happening, then get in touch and we'll get you added. These working groups are always looking for new participants. If you're not an IoTSF member, but you'd like to be involved in any of the working groups, then go to iotsecurityfoundation.org/join. And as part of your membership, you'll receive login credentials for Basecamp. So we'll get things going in a couple of moments with today's webinar. The first part of today's webinar is all about the European Cyber Resilience Act. Before going on sale to the European market, the CRA will require network-connected hardware, software, and services to meet essential cybersecurity requirements. It will place obligations on manufacturers to maintain their security throughout the product lifecycle. Our first speaker today is Florian Lukavsky. He started his hacker career at an early age, bypassing parental control systems, and he went on to report numerous zero-day vulnerabilities responsibly to software vendors, and he conducted hundreds of pen tests and security reviews as a CREST-certified ethical hacker. After building offensive cybersecurity teams in Singapore, Malaysia, Thailand, and Switzerland, he founded ONEKEY. Today, Florian aids organizations with SBOM, security and compliance, automation for connected devices. He is the CTO of ONEKEY, which is the leading European product security platform. He's also a member of the IoTSF Supply Chain Working Group, which recently published the SBOM white paper, and he joins us now from Vienna. Florian, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction and the kind words, and very warm welcome to everyone here in the room. Let me sort out the screen sharing. So I hope you will be able to see my screen share now. And yeah, as mentioned, we will be diving into the upcoming EU legislation, into the upcoming Cyber Resilience Act. But before we talk about the Cyber Resilience Act, let's take a short step back to look at the big picture, the overall EU cybersecurity strategy they have been following for the past year. Not past year, past years. So we can, if we look at EU legislations, we can see many different acts, many different directives, regulations, all somewhat intertwined with cybersecurity, putting cybersecurity requirements into various fields. So if we look at product legislation, so under the new legislation framework, for example, we have many cybersecurity relevant topics already under the radio equipment directive, for example, where last year a new version was released, which also puts obligations on cybersecurity. If we look into regulations for medical devices, for in vitro devices, for automotive devices, there's a security requirement. Also, if you're operating critical infrastructure, so as an operator, you have to follow resilience, you have to follow security standards. And this is true for many different fields. With the CHIPS Act, for example, regulation of machinery products. The EU is also working on legislation for artificial intelligence to impose security requirements. Yeah, a few years ago, one thing that marched across the globe was the General Data Protection Regulation, the GDPR, which had a huge impact also on organizations worldwide, and in particular those targeting European citizens. And the EU Cyber Resilience Act is the newest kid on the block, so to say. A new piece of legislation the European Commission is currently working on and is planning to enact in the upcoming months. Yeah, let's take a look at the purpose of the Cyber Resilience Act. So the two main purposes the European Commission is following is, on the one side, to motivate organizations, to motivate vendors to release more secure products to the European market. So to pay more attention to remediate vulnerabilities before shipping software and before shipping devices. And on the other side, also to increase the level of transparency. So to allow any users, any buyers of products with digital elements, as the EU refers to it, to allow them to make more informed decision, to actually take security into consideration when making a purchasing decision about a new piece of software or a new device. And in a nutshell, to facilitate those goals, the European Commission is imposing rules for placing hardware and software on the market, and those rules, those obligations, they're targeted not only at the manufacturers of those devices, but also at importers and distributors. So in case the manufacturer is based outside the European Union, so in different legislative environments, the importers and distributors who actually import the devices will be held accountable. And in a nutshell, with the EU Cyber Resilience Act, manufacturers will be mandated to provide secure products. They will be mandated to maintain vulnerability management, so to also make sure that the security level is not only there at the beginning of the product life cycle, but remains at a high level throughout the entire life cycle. And finally, also to report exploited vulnerabilities to the ENISA, so that ENISA, the Central Security Agency of the European Union, can also coordinate and react to large-scale cyber attacks, for example. So this, in a nutshell, is the Cyber Resilience Act. But let's step in a little bit deeper and look at what is actually in scope of the Cyber Resilience Act. So the Cyber Resilience Act always speaks about so-called products with digital elements. So that's any software or hardware that has some sort of data connection. It doesn't necessarily need to be connected to the internet, but being connected to some other system or to some network is sufficient for this product with digital elements to actually be in scope of the Cyber Resilience Act. So the scope is actually very wide, ranging from hardware products such as smartphones, notebooks, IoT devices, but also covering software products such as operating systems, games, mobile apps, etc. So anything that relies on network connectivity. There's a few items that are exempt from the Cyber Resilience Act. On the one side, open source projects that are not targeted or that don't have a commercial interest in mind. SaaS solutions, SaaS services are out of scope as well. They are planned to be regulated by other means, and also industries where stricter regulation is in place today already are exempt from the Cyber Resilience Act. So this involves medical devices, in vitro and diagnostic medical devices, as well as devices for motor vehicles and products certified for civil aviation. And finally, also devices and products for national security or military purposes are not in scope because the European Commission assumes that there will be higher security requirements for such devices anyways. The Cyber Resilience Act also differentiates between different product classes. So there's, in total, there's 3 different classes. The highest class is class 2 critical products, which involves central networking components, which is used in an industrial setup, for example, or robot sensing and actuator components, so devices that may influence safety or human health or environmental factors very much. And the second class of devices are critical products, or class 1 critical products, which involve routers and switches for non-industrial use, for example, traffic monitoring systems, antivirus systems, remote access systems. Products that have a high impact on data security, for example, that are central to network communication, etc. And finally, in the last category, everything else, so the non-critical products. Why am I listing those? Well, there's different requirements in terms of providing evidence that the obligations of the Cyber Resilience Act are actually taken into consideration. And the EU is aiming at a 90%, 10% cut, so requiring certification only for maximum 10% of the products, so the class 2 critical devices. For the next section, the class 1 critical devices, harmonized standards will need to be followed during development of the devices. And for the final categories, self-assessments will also be sufficient to demonstrate compliance with the upcoming regulations. And from the type of legislation, the EU Cyber Resilience Act is very similar to the GDPR. Like the GDPR, it applies horizontally across all industries. So it's not specific to certain industries. And also the penalties that it sets are quite hefty. So for non-compliance with Articles 10 and 11, which describe the obligations, 15 million euro or 2.5% of the global annual revenue are set as penalties, and this lessens for lesser violations. But let's take a look at a case study. So we are in the future. The Cyber Resilience Act is enacted already, and we're looking at Wayne Enterprises, a huge corporate conglomerate headquartered in Gotham City and headed by Bruce Wayne. They have an annual revenue of more than 30 billion US dollars and a lot of subsidiaries. So the subsidiary that will likely be most affected by the Cyber Resilience Act is Wayne Electronics, because Wayne Electronics, they have a wide array of different devices in their product portfolio. So they manufacture radios, hi-fi systems, cameras, etc., but also surveillance equipment, computers, as well as wired and wireless networks. So also devices that are likely to be under critical class 1 or class 2 items, and definitely many products with digital elements as defined by the Cyber Resilience Act. So let's take a look at what the what Wayne Industries would need to consider now. So if we look at the product security lifecycle, from concept and design to development, production, and launch, all the way through service and support. So the entire life cycle from birth to death of a product. We see that the Cyber Resilience Act has a very risk-based approach. So risk assessment, risk management will be required throughout all life cycle, and this is something which will also need to be updated and maintained throughout the life cycle. During the concept and design phase, the development department of Wayne Electronics will need to consider secure by design principles. It will need to perform due diligence for all third-party dependencies, for all third-party components it is shipping as part of its products. It will also need to follow transparency obligations, so to publish and maintain user information, to specify the intended use of the product, for example, to supply information such as security contact of the product. It will also need to maintain technical documentation, including software bill of material for the product, which needs to be available and needs to be accessible for investigations by European authorities. And it will also need to conduct product conformity assessments. So based on the class, based on the criticality of the device, either as a self-assessment or as part of the CE label, also certifying the product or the processes with which the products were developed. So those are obligations mainly targeting the development department of Wayne Electronics. If we look at ongoing operations, so if we look at the product security incident response team at Wayne Electronics, they need to deal with vulnerability management. We will step into this a little bit deeper in a moment. But they will also will be required to report vulnerabilities to the ENISA. Also, any vulnerabilities that are actively being exploited will need to be reported to the ENISA within 24 hours, and they will also need to follow coordinated vulnerability disclosure processes. So if we look at vulnerability management a little bit closer, just to provide one example, because time is too short to dig into all the requirements under the Cyber Resilience Act. We see many requirements there as well. So to have ongoing processes in place to identify and document new vulnerabilities. Also to address and remediate them in a timely manner, and have possibilities, have means available to also provide those updates to the users. Those security patches will also needed. Those security patches will also be needed to be made available free of charge to the users of the products. And security advisories will need to be published to also provide transparency and about the risk of vulnerabilities that have been addressed, so that users can also make an informed decisions on how urgent it is to apply certain security patches. And finally, they are also required to regularly test and review the security of the product. So again, tie into the ongoing risk assessment of the product. And after fulfilling all those items and all those requirements, Vane Electronics can finally export its devices to the European Union again. And yeah, with this introduction into the Cyber Resilience Act, I pass on back to you. I'm available for questions if there is. And yeah, hope you enjoyed the session.
Florian, I love the Wayne Enterprises angle. That was absolutely fantastic. Thank you very much for that.
You're welcome.
There's still a few people coming into the webinar. So if you've been a little bit late in joining us today, be aware that this webinar, as always, is being recorded and it will be available to IoTSF members. I should say that last month's webinar is actually available on YouTube to watch for everybody, IoTSF members and non-members alike. That was about smart built environment and the guidance for facilities professionals. I'll tell you what, for people that are watching this live, I'll get one of my colleagues to drop the YouTube link into the chat function for this Zoom webinar, and you can have it there if you missed last month's IoTSF webinar. Speaking of the chat function, by the way, if you've got a question for Florian Lukavsky, if you want to ask it just now in the chat, then I'll ask it a bit later on during the Q&A section. I say this every month. We get to the Q&A section and people are a little bit shy, and then all of a sudden there's an avalanche of questions and we end up having not enough time to ask all of the questions. So the earlier in this webinar that you get your question in, then the better the chance of it being asked. So just give your mouse a bit of a shuffle and you'll see the Zoom function appear for the chat. Anyway, moving on to the next part of today's webinar. The IoT Security Foundation is very much a global organization, and by way of illustrating that, we're now crossing to the Southern Hemisphere to hear about OT and IoT evaluation, certification, and cybersecurity labeling. With Singapore, the USA, Finland, Germany, and India all still trying to determine consumer safety model, this is very much a hot topic. Matt Tett might be familiar to many watching today as he spoke at IoTSF's annual conference this past October in London. Matt is an advisor and subject matter expert for IoT Security Mark, who operates the global IoT Security Trust Mark certification and voluntary cybersecurity labeling scheme. So it's 24 minutes past 11 in the evening, I think, where Matt is. And so we're very grateful for him joining us way past bedtime in Melbourne. But here he is. Matt Tett, the floor is yours, my friend.
Thank you, Chris. I'll just share my screen if I can. Let me It is 11:25 p.m. and I've been working since 3 a.m. this morning. So I had to be out on site helping some of our team in the field. So it's been a very long day and night. So please bear with me. My accent is genuine. It is real. It's not just because I'm absolutely tired. And I'll try and speak slowly and articulately for all international guests. But thank you very much for having me. Hopefully I won't keep you too long. I am interested also in getting through to the Q&A. So without further ado, we'll proceed. For those of you who don't know who I am, my name's Matt Tett. I'm the managing director of an organisation called NX Test Lab, also the founder of the Day of the Month Club, and I'm an advisor and subject matter expert for the IoT Security Trust Mark certification and cybersecurity labelling scheme, which is the capacity that I'm here for today. So we've all heard about the standards, recommendations, guidelines and codes. There's hundreds of them and they cover all gamuts of, as Europe put it, devices with digital elements, or as the US put it, we're still trying to define what IoT actually means. So I think we've all had to come across them, those of us who work with vendors and manufacturers, particularly global vendors and manufacturers. Now, I must apologize to Florian. I had to delete half my slides because I did have Marvel references through all mine, and I couldn't really comprehend whether we can have this Marvel DC universe sort of conflict, and we don't want to start like another conflict around the world. So I've deleted all those, and I'll stick with Star Wars references. So this is more of a joke slide. I did do a presentation last year where a number of people told me that the fine print was too fine and that it was too confusing. And thankfully, as I'm sure most of you are aware, late 2022, the World Economic Forum came out with a joint statement essentially saying we need to come up with some consensus of what constitutes good practice, best practice, and baseline requirements for cybersecurity. I think one of the key messages that I'd like to get through today is that we're all in this together, that IoT security is a global issue and it's not constrained to one nation or one geography or one jurisdiction. I think that's the main message that I'd like to get across to people. Sure, each jurisdiction and territory have their own governments, which are responsible for the safety of their nations and the security and the privacy of their citizens and their public, but at the end of the day, the vendors who manufacture the products and the device makers need to know what the minimum mandatory or minimum best practice actually is. And the thing that I like about the IoT Security Foundation is that they're looking at a global role and looking at a global focus around that and trying to bring us all together and get us all on the same page. So echoing the World Economic Forum, let's have some consensus and harmonization when it comes to baseline security practices, guidelines and codes. And I'm sure since 2018, when a lot of governments and agencies started first discussing this, particularly the UK government, who led by example with their guidelines and adopting some of the EN 303-645 standards as their guide, they've set a really good example. I think from that perspective, we then move on to who are the interested parties. So who are the organizations which are looking at this proactively and who are looking at solving, I guess, the compliance or the certification type issues. And this is the next step of the presentation, where we look at organizations that are taking a proactive view when it comes to ensuring that manufacturers and vendors, and I'm not here to beat up any manufacturers and vendors, at the end of the day, they're the ones that develop the technologies which benefit us as a society, and we look forward to engaging with, but we do know that there are gaps and weaknesses and things that they need to improve to deliver their consumers with more safe, secure and private products. So governments of Singapore, Finland, Germany, India, and also Europe have discussed developing their own cybersecurity certification and labeling schemes internally. Singapore and Finland are very well advanced, as I'm sure we're aware, and luckily they've actually harmonized. The good news with all the standards, baselines, guidelines, and requirements that governments are setting is there aren't any conflicts as yet. So they may be all on the same page and all different parts of the same page, but luckily we haven't started rewriting a separate book. So proactive governments are really good. Singapore, Finland, Germany, India, Europe. Interestingly, Australia, Standards Australia has decided as a standards defining organisation to start discussing the prospect of launching or developing certification or cybersecurity assurance program here. So that came out last year. They released a public statement saying they were keen to do it, even though it's against their memorandum of understanding with the government. And I think most people agree standards defining organisations are there for standards and standards development. Industry. So industry launched the IoT Alliance, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. And again, that's a security pledge, which their member vendors are swearing themselves to and making sure that they're providing self-attestation that they meet a minimum level of standards and requirements in terms of their products. And I know a lot of people have knocked that, but I think it's actually a good, I guess, line in the sand, which the proactive vendors are the ones which are stepping over that line and saying we do pledge that those 8 requirements. And the fact that there's 8 requirements they're pledging means that it's testable. So for vendors making a claim to the market about their capabilities or what they decide to live up to, at the end of the day, you can test compliance and conformance with that. And I'd rather have a vendor making a claim about security than a vendor not making a claim about security. So we all know from a marketing perspective, vendors aren't going to say the things that they're bad at. They're only going to say the things that they're good at. So if they're not making public claims about security, then we've got to start asking those questions, or at least educating consumers and procurement agencies to ask the relevant questions about the product security to their vendors, and hopefully the message will get across. There's third-party bodies, third-party certification bodies, such as underwriters laboratories in the UK, SGS, TUV, and BV in Europe, and also accreditation providers, so providers who have traditionally provided accreditation services to industries, like IASME in the UK, are also keenly following this market. I think in terms of regulation, we've obviously heard from Florian talking about the European standard, that the European bill and act, which is great. And also, as we're aware, UK has also passed the PSTI bill last year. So a number of governments and agencies around the world are obviously following those very closely, and it will be good to see Europe come up as the next, I guess, jurisdiction which has got some legislation behind them. I think as an industry, or industries in general, technology industry's been very adverse to regulation. We don't like the concept of having to be regulated or policed, but I think at the end of the day, it is a necessary evil when we look at the vendors who are non-conforming. Regulators need a stick, and sometimes vendors need a carrot. So the leading vendors have got the carrot that they're going for, and they will be compliant, and they will start moving towards incorporating security by design. A lot of us will argue that, well, you know, the warning shots were fired in 2018 by the governments. They sort of stated what the minimum requirements were that you should build into your products coming up. So in reality, the proactive vendors should have really been building security in by design for almost 5 years now. I think the UK first started talking about it in October 2018 when their guidelines were released. And so really it's been 5 years, which it moves very quick for those of us who have been involved in this. So now, one of the things which, I'll just go back quickly to that slide. What's the one thing, or the 2 things here that sort of tie these together And I think one of them is, if I was a vendor, this is very confusing. Who do I go with? Which countries am I selling to? Who do I have to conform with? Which ones are harmonized? Which ones can I claim compliance across multiple jurisdictions? Vendors are used to a cost for conformance when it comes to things like electrical safety, or it comes to things like emissions, so radio frequency or other conformance, so that, you know, they know how to do QA, they know how to ensure that their products conform, and security will just be another level of conformance and compliance. But vendors hate how long it takes them to get compliance, and they hate how much it costs them. So they always talk about the cost of compliance, which is why they're very often resistive to regulators regulating and potentially even enforcing, because of the penalties and the policing that it's costing them. So one of the uniform things here, which is a bit like the standard slide, is these are all territorial. These are all focused on certain jurisdictions, certain areas, so certain, I guess, geopolitical areas. The issue that we all know is criminals don't conform to norms. So they're not going to look at, I'm only going to comply with the requirements because Singapore has quite a high level of cybersecurity requirements on their vendors. So there's no point in attacking a router in Singapore because they've passed conformance. Or a vendor conversely may say, gee, Singapore's got such a high level of compliance, I'm not going to sell my product into their market, and therefore potentially disadvantage the consumers in that market, or force a false economy when it comes to the cost of security. And security, at the end of the day, should be inherent. The automotive industry has learned to sell safety as a feature, and I think the technology industry needs to learn how to sell security and privacy and safety as a feature. So the key thing here is that these are all jurisdictionally based and focused on domestic markets and their own domestic programs. And that's fine, providing, as I say, we still all stay on the same page and that there's some consistency and harmony, which is what we've called for. The other thing is all of them are suggesting and recommending binary or static labeling. And as we know, with security, it's not a binary or a static issue. It changes all the time. And that's one of the hardest things that we've had to deal with in our professional lives, is a moving target. And we've all heard it plenty of times. It's whack-a-mole. You hit them in one place and they'll pop up somewhere else. You raise the bar to a certain standard and then they'll exceed the standard or find workarounds. And at the end of the day, it is just chasing that. But security is not a new problem. Just because we're in the digital world and it's digital elements and products that we're talking about, like, we've always had security issues, and security's always been a global issue, whether it's automotive security, household security, business security. From a physical aspect, there's always other levels of the value of the information or value of the asset that you're trying to protect or ensure or look after. And so I think some of the key things that we need to look at, and this is what we've looked at as the IoT Trust Mark frameworks developed over the last 15 years, 16 years now, is it needs to be a global framework. It needs to be something that the world can get behind and focus on. It can't be proprietary. It needs to be something that's open, that all governments, all vendors, all conformance bodies, standards bodies can actually get behind. It needs to provide some level of uniform conformity. As I said, there needs to be a consensus around what constitutes a good baseline requirement. From our perspective, currently, the leading standard is the ETSI EN 303-645 standard, and that's a really good start. And as I said, most jurisdictions are actually not following all of the 13 criteria, but are following a subset of those. So therefore, our theory is if you can provide conformance or certification or compliance for a vendor's product to those 13 criteria, then any jurisdiction which is providing, say UK, the top 3, or Australia, the top 3, then obviously that product's going to be suitable for that market. Certification is key. Vendors like having certification folders. It makes them rest easy at night to know that they've actually passed certification. However, as I said, security is only as good as the day you're in it, and you could pass conformance today, and then tomorrow there's a publicly known vulnerability which is released around your product in your software bill of materials or a component of your software bill of materials, and that basically renders your conformance or your compliance null. And so you have to have a live cybersecurity label. You can't have a static or a binary label which is displayed on a product because it gives a false sense of security to the consumers or the people that are procuring the products, and even the organizations themselves. They've got to know, like the vulnerability disclosure policies, you don't just have a policy and not act on it. You have a policy and you act on it. The only, I guess, vendor that this is going to affect is vendors that have hardware vulnerabilities and that they can't remediate. So it's not a software vulnerability, it's not in their firmware, it's not in their back end, it's actually something physically on their hardware device. And you can't certify, those products can be certified, but then that certification needs to be revoked as soon as a hardware vulnerability is known, and a workaround, a mitigation strategy or a gap needs to actually be developed to provide advice to those vendors. So what we do, what it doesn't do, it doesn't put lipstick on a pig. So I can't be more blunt than that. A lot of vendors think that they can come and pay for conformance or compliance and they'll just get a big green tick and 5 gold stars and that they can go on their merry way. And once they've paid their dues, that's it. Unfortunately, it's not the way it works, as we know. And a lot of them are discovering now is that they should have started 5 years ago. They should have started incorporating security by design. They should have started looking at what baseline standards were available at that point in time. And the ETSI standard has been around for that long. And so they could have started building that in. They need to ensure that it does that. We find that 90% of the products that we're putting through the evaluation process actually fail on the desktop audit. So it doesn't cost the vendors a great deal of money to find out that they're not going to actually pass when they bring the product into the lab. And then that gives them food for thought to go away and start incorporating that security by design in their upcoming products. It does provide assurance that the product conforms with recognized security standards, so baseline requirements. Again, not locking into any one standard. We're not saying, well, at the moment, the ETSI standard may be gold standard. In 8 years' time or 10 years' time or 15 years' time, there may be international standards. Look at the way British standard 7799 evolved into ISO 27001. So perfect example, standards don't stay static either. Looks after vendors, so the people that are selling the products, making sure that their products conform with recognized standards. Distributors of those products, so Florian mentioned, you could be a US company in Gotham City. I didn't actually realize it was a real place in the US until tonight. It's a joke. Distributors, so yeah, you could be a US vendor that has a distributor in Europe, and the European distributor is concerned that maybe they're not complying with the Europe requirements, but the vendor's not necessarily aware of what the European requirements are. So you need to make sure you have a global conformance strategy and compliance with the standards of those jurisdictions. Partners of those distributors and vendors to make sure they're working, and customers as well. So the consumers, ultimately, they're the beneficiary of any certification or labeling scheme. Value and time frame, as I said, cost of conformance, cost of compliance is one of the big things that vendors are always concerned about. And we've addressed that in the Trustmark program. We get a pass or a fail within 30 days, and it's very low cost. So the best value possible, as I said, there's a desktop evaluation component. So it's a bit like having a roadworthy certificate for your vehicle or an MOT for your vehicle, and being able to call up the garage or email the garage and say, here's a photo of my vehicle. Can you tell me whether the windscreen with a crack in it or the tires with that are bald or the rust holes in the side of the car are going to pass the MOT or the roadworthy? And the mechanic can reply straight away, no. And then you can go and remediate it without having to go to the expense of taking your vehicle in, putting it through the roadworthy process and finding out that you've failed. So it only hits the lab once it passes the vendor's claims documentation stage, and that the decision authority accepts that as being possible. Who funds it? So a lot of organizations are looking to governments to fund their certification or their assurance programs. This is self-funded, so the program funds itself. It is a global program, and it's a federated model which has been developed as part of the framework with a whole lot of different ecosystem partners in each jurisdiction. And ultimately, it's the product vendors who pay for their products to go through the conformance program. Can also be prospective customers or users, so people who are in procurement, who are interested to see whether the products that they're looking at evaluating actually meet the conformance requirements that they have. So if the product hasn't already got or attained certification, they know where the gaps are, if there are gaps, or they know whether the product conforms with the standards or their requirements, or even existing owners and users. So we've done some work for some operational technology utilities, so critical infrastructure providers who have legacy systems, and they're really keen to know whether the products that they've procured over the last 3 or 4 years, what level of conformance they have with the standards and the baseline requirements. And that's very interesting to actually go through, because it helps them identify their gaps, and it helps them patch those gaps in the meantime, come up with other ways of ensuring that they're at least they're as secure as they possibly can be, while also reporting that back to their vendors and saying, you know, you need to ensure that the next iteration of this product complies with these requirements, because these are the gaps that we've discovered. Live labeling, it's another one of the unique parts of the intellectual property that we're protecting around the world. And I'll never say thank you for COVID, but COVID did introduce the consumer to how to use QR codes. They're not perfect, so don't beat me up for saying that QR codes are the be all and end all, but at the end of the day, currently the best, most consumer accessible form is a QR code, which shows a live label, which gives them access to the traffic light system, which if there's a known vulnerability in the software bill of materials that's been declared by the vendor as part of their certification process, then the decision authority will contact the vendor, notify them that their products move to an orange state or an amber state, which is suspended until they remediate that, and their accredited test facility provides a document of conformance that they've actually mitigated that threat or that risk through that vulnerability satisfactorily, and then they'll move back to a green state. If they can't remediate it, so if it's a vulnerability, say in the hardware, then that vendor will move to a red, that product will move to a red or an expired state. And that this has actually now been taken up by some I guess, the notification companies that look at logging, and they're actually looking now, building this into their back end. So if a consumer or a procurement agent purchases a number of these products, they can actually build it into their alerting system. So when the product moves from green to amber to red, then it's built into their alert system. So again, they know to look at what CVEs or national vulnerabilities have been released and work out mitigations for their own environment. So thank you. Just a little plug at the end there. So the Security Trust Mark's a framework for a global independent third-party conformity assessment, certification and live cybersecurity labeling scheme of internet-connected products. So I think we've got 12 minutes to go. I'll stop my screen sharing, and hopefully we can have some interactive Q&A. Thank you.
Without one single hint of fatigue. Thank you very much indeed, Matt Tett in Melbourne. I've got a couple of bits and pieces just to run through incredibly quickly, because I'm aware that we do not have much time left for the Q&A. But last week, we were delighted to announce the launch of IoTSF Bangalore, which is IoTSF's second regional chapter alongside IoTSF Bucharest. In case you're unfamiliar, the whole point of chapters is so that IoTSF members can drive awareness and best practices at a regional level. I'd like to give a shout out to the IoTSF Bangalore founders. They are Amitesh, Abhishek, Mike and Amit. If you're in or around Bangalore, Bengaluru, and would like to get involved with them, you can find contact details on iotsecurityfoundation.org/chapters. If you're a potential sponsor and you're looking to get your brand out there to the IoT security community, then make no mistake, yes, this chapter is regional, but it will have a global audience when it does its own events and webinars, etc. Look out for details of the next monthly IoTSF webinar. It will take place on Thursday, the 25th of May, and we'll have details soon of the topic and speakers. One final thing is to mention this year's 2023 IoTSF conference. It's going to take place on November the 7th. It's going to be at the IET in London. That's in Savoy Place. We're going to open the call for papers around about mid-May, but to confirm, that's the 2023 IoTSF conference taking place in London, in Savoy Place at the IET on November the 7th. So let's get the Q&A underway, and as is customary these days, as a host privilege or a host abuse, anytime, any way you want to look at it, I'm going to ask the first question. I'm going to make this one to Florian. When can we expect the CRA to be enacted, Florian?
Thank you. Very good question. I mean, there's no set timeline yet. Current plans from the European Commission foresee to enact the Cyber Security Resilience Act in early 2024. So before the EU elections, which are scheduled for May. And after that, there's planned to be a 24 months grace period until, before all obligations will need to be met. And for the reporting obligations, 12-month grace period is foreseen.
Thank you, Florian. Matt, my question to you, how do we raise more awareness of labeling?
I think that's a really good question. Thanks, Chris. It comes down to, I think, the industry uniting. It's not about us as security professionals telling the vendors what they need to do. It's about getting the vendors that are proactive, so the leading vendors, to actually get behind this and realize that we're not there to beat them with a big stick, that we are actually the ones with a carrot, and hopefully the leading vendors around the world will actually embrace some of these programs and ensure that they do actually help them with their products, and they will help them with their sales. So people who are buying products, and sure, mums and dads are concerned, they hear all the news stories about, you know, something that happened to someone down the road or a scam that's taken someone's money, but they never really relate it directly to them and until it affects them. So it's really getting organizations that are buying connected devices to start asking those questions. So not just government departments and agencies that are purchasing connected devices, but also larger organizations or even small to medium enterprises asking their manufacturers, what are you doing to protect our safety, our security and our privacy in our products, rather than having to bolt it on afterwards. You can't bolt security on by design. You've got to build it in.
Thank you, Matt. I think this one's for you, Florian. Does CRA apply for industrial IoT products like smart power meters, electrical equipment, and electric distribution industry?
Yes.
That's from Satya Katria, excuse me.
Yes, so the Cyber Resilience Act will apply across industries, so also for industrial devices. And it will apply to all devices that have some sort of network connectivity. It doesn't need to be internet connectivity, so it would also be sufficient for a device, for example, to have CAN access or only a Bluetooth connection or something like that.
Satya has actually got a follow-up question as well, Florian. Also, does it apply to smart UPSs that have capability to have network connectivity?
Yes.
Thank you.
Can I just quickly, Chris?
Yeah, go ahead, Matt, go on.
Yeah, sitting neutrally and independently across all this over the years, it's interesting seeing the different level that various jurisdictions are at. As I mentioned, from I guess a regulatory or legislative perspective, the UK and Europe are leading the world with that, and almost standards as well with the ETSI standard. But then you look at all countries like the US or Australia or Canada, and they're on a different speed. So the US has been talking about IoT cybersecurity for a number of years now. Since President Biden got in, he issued an executive order for NIST to take a look at it. They're now at a point several years later of actually having an IoT security advisory group who are still debating what the best terminology for the words Internet of Things is. So what constitutes the Internet of Things? Whereas Europe just came out and said any device with a digital element. And that's so simple, so straightforward. Anyone can understand what that means. When we applied for our certification trademark, we need certification trademarks in every jurisdiction that we're operating in, ironically, trying to bring the world together on a security perspective, and then every jurisdiction requires a different certification trademark. They're all different applications. Canada actually changed their rules within the last 2 years to say, we need you to list every single product that could potentially be connected to the internet. Not just the internet, any product could be certified. So as Florian mentioned, it's not, they're interconnected devices. So my microwave has Bluetooth that connects to my phone. That's still a connected device, even though it's only my phone which is connected to the internet, not my microwave. So that would fall under a device with a digital element. Whereas US is still debating what IoT is and means. And Canada is saying, give us 7,280 odd product categories or classes can be connected. So it took our team a number of weeks to define the list. And I never knew a mattress could be connected to the internet, but it can. And a mattress topper. I
have to say, IoT mattresses haven't quite made it to Edinburgh, where I am just yet, but I'll certainly look out for those alongside microwaves. This next question is for Florian, I assume, although Matt, obviously you can jump in if you fancy. I hope I'm pronouncing this gentleman's name correctly. It's Ingo Cooper. What does CRA mean for legacy products?
So for legacy products, there's a grandfather clause in the Cyber Resilience Act. So if products have been on the market already before the Cyber Resilience Act comes into force, there's no new obligations. However, if there's a repurpose of the device, or if there's a significant change of the device, the Cyber Resilience Act will apply.
Next up, this is a question, and actually Miri has answered the question within the chat. So I'll read out both the question and Mary's response to it, and perhaps Florian, you can agree, disagree. Paul Kearney says, it sounds like the CRA is going to add costs and delays in development and bringing a product to market. Is it going to be a barrier to market entry and or put European firms at a competitive disadvantage? Now, Mary has come in on the chat facility and she's given this answer, Florian. It will make the market more safe and secure and will kick out vendors that don't prioritize security. Not only European manufacturers will have to comply, but any manufacturer that would like to place his products. This could bring a competitive advantage to European vendors that will prepare on time. Do you want to elaborate or agree or disagree with that, Florian?
I mean, I see it very similarly. I mean, yes, it will add additional cost. Yes, it will add additional activities that need to be performed. But I mean, at least from a security standpoint, everything what is defined in the Cyber Resilience Act makes sense. So if you're following industry best practices already, there's a good chance you're doing 99% of what is required by the Cyber Resilience Act already anyways. And I mean, there's some debate around whether it will cause a competitive disadvantage, especially from an open source perspective, because there's currently some uncertainty whether open source foundations who also receive donations fall into commercial aspects or not, whether they will withdraw from the European market and won't make the products available in Europe anymore. I mean, in the end, I foresee that similar to the GDPR, which is kind of a blueprint when it comes to data protection globally, that also for the Cyber Resilience Act, many countries will follow and demand very similar requirements. So I think we are up for a change in how we develop software and how we operate software.
Thank you very much, Florian. One final comment from Ingo again in the chat facility. Also keep in mind that for other, in inverted quotation marks, products, just means self-assessment. Products in other classes might be in scope for other certification requirements already. I don't know if either one of you wants to. Matt,
Yeah,
you're nodding along.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, things like automotive, we hear a lot of the standards and medical device security. So there's certain levels like critical infrastructure or defense level security. There are already standards and requirements that the people that are procuring those products expect their manufacturers to conform or comply with. They may not be great, they may not be publicized, but the vendors have already considered those because of the fact that they rely on human safety, human lives. And so there are, and so you'll find some of the regulators try and avoid that. Some of the regulators shift it to other regulators. So in Australia, for example, we have the Therapeutical Goods Administration, which looks after security and safety and privacy of connected medical devices. And then we also have the National Transport Agency, which looks after connected vehicles and intelligent transport systems. Again, it's the regulators dividing, hopefully conquering, because at the end of the day, you do need a regulatory regime. But what I was going to say is, without regulations and legislations, then the governments can't enforce. So, and there are minimum, the standards that they're expecting the vendors to comply with, they're not trivial if you're not already doing it. But if you're already doing it, they are trivial, which is what Florian was saying. So things like having a vulnerability disclosure policy, it's not rocket science. At the end of the day, you just got to work out the best practice, write the policies and procedures and follow it, enact it, actually do it. Sure, having things like no default passwords is not an easy task to achieve. However, at the end of the day, like I said, the UK have been asking for that for 5 years. They've only just passed their bill. They've still got to put a regulator in place, and then the regulator has to work out how to police the system. So vendors are probably going to have 6 or 7 years warning. Like in Europe, there's still another 24 months period after. So we're probably looking at almost 3 years before they even start appointing a regulator, putting regulators into different nations and enforcing. So vendors, you know how quickly technology changes, 3, 6 month, 12-month cycles. Yeah, obviously not OT, but IoT, there's plenty of time for vendors to conform.
Time is up, I'm afraid. I'll get a couple more comments in. Daniel Morris says, cheaper to apply for than to defend. Sure, there's a life lesson there. And I'll end with this joke. Paul Kearney says, I think smart mattresses are available in test bed form. Boom, boom. And on that note, we wrap up this month's IoTSF monthly webinar. If you're an IoTSF member, you'll be able to watch this recording, and you'll be able to watch our recordings from January, February, and March. They're all going to be available on the Basecamp platform. As I mentioned earlier, IoTSF's 2023 conference is going to be in London at the IET at Savoy Place on November the 7th. Thank you very much for joining us today. My thanks to my, I guess, behind the steering wheel, my colleague Grant and Palm as well. Very special thanks to my fantastic and wonderful speakers today. Florian joining us from Vienna and Matt joining us from Melbourne. From Bonnie, Scotland, from myself, Chris, thank you again, and we'll see you next month.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.